Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Windward Academy webinar. Our presentation today is going to be focused on how to apply for accommodations on the ACT and the SAT. So the way that things are kind of planned for us for today is to break down the exact steps that you have to follow when you're applying for ACT time or extra time, and the exact steps that you need to follow if you're applying for accommodations on the SAT. And the reason I'm going to go through both is because it's actually a little bit different and there are some nuances in what you want to put together depending on which organization you're applying to. So we'll go ahead and get started. Now, the first thing that I want to do is really impress on all of you that the importance of kind of going through this process of applying for accommodations is all about the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can't apply for accommodations with the argument that, it would be easier for my son or daughter to get extra time, or, more time would really help, right? Those types of arguments are not going to fly. They know that it would be easier for all students to get extra time, right? So the real burden on all of you as you're putting together your packages to submit to ACT or SAT is that you have to really establish that this is all about equal access. This is because of a substantial limitation. This is because of a substantial impairment, right? That is the reason why this accommodation is necessary. So I think if you keep in your head that really your burden is to show that per the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, there is some sort of mental, or physical impairment, and that is producing a substantial limitation. And that if these accommodations are not provided, then there's an issue of equal access being presented. Because if you can come back to this law, right, and this idea of the ADA, that is how you can guarantee that you can get these accommodations. Because again, they're very sensitive, they're very concerned because there are people who try to take advantage of this. There are people who have kids who do not have any type of substantial limitation and they try to kind of game the system a little bit to get extra time. That happens, right? It's an unfortunate reality. And it's even more unfortunate for the students who really do deserve these accommodations because sometimes their needs are washed over a little bit because there are other people kind of trying to game the system. So the reason it was important to me to really host this, and I think I forgot to introduce myself, I'm sorry. I'm Dr. Jennifer Windward. I'm the founder and CEO of Windward Academy. So sorry about that. But the reason it was really important to us at Windward Academy to put this together is to make sure that for the students who really do deserve to acquire these accommodations on ACT and SAT, we want to make sure that you know the exact steps to follow. And I also want to share some stories with you of students we've supported and families we've supported in this process and kind of what they've seen and how they've been able to overcome, some of the hurdles in acquiring these accommodations. So I'm going to start with ACT. So we're going to start by kind of going through what are the 5 steps that you have to take to secure accommodations from the ACT. And by the way, I'm also going to give you insights around what are the different accommodations that they even offer, right? Sometimes parents aren't even aware of things that they can ask for their kids. So I want to make sure to go through that with you. So you'll notice what we're going to start with is kind of what do you need to do to determine eligibility? So how do you even know if you can apply for any accommodations from ACT? So what does ACT say? So ACT requires that if a student is going to request an accommodation, these are the criteria that need to be met. Number 1, there needs to be a diagnosis and some sort of formal documentation by a licensed professional or by licensed professionals, so by several people. Number 2, we have to show a direct impact of the disability on ACT test performance. So again, this gets back to what I shared earlier. This is not about having more time would be helpful, right? The argument here is that if I don't get more time, I do not have equal access to perform at my abilities. So again, we have to show that there is going to be this direct impact, that there's some sort of disability, there's some sort of substantial limitation that is going to adversely impact performance on the ACT test. The third thing is documentation that includes specific information about any current accommodations currently being provided or any long-standing accommodations that have been provided, right? So when you think about the documentation that you're going to end up wanting to organize, you really want to think back as far as you can, right? What are teachers who maybe initially expressed concerns? Do you have that documented in a school report card or in an email that was sent to you or in some sort of work that you've done at a learning center at your son or daughter's school? So again, when you're thinking about, am I eligible, you want to make sure that you can check all three of these boxes before you go through the process of applying, because this is going to be how they determine whether or not you're eligible. Now, when you apply for accommodations from the ACT, there are kind of two buckets of where they offer accommodations. And the first one is on their national testing days. So that means that if the ACT is offered on Saturday, April 17th, all over the world, a student who receives these accommodations gets those accommodations on that national test day. So these are the different options for that. So again, you are taking the test at a random testing site on a Saturday morning or on a Sunday morning, and what's available to you if you apply for a national accommodation. So they offer 50% extended time, so 1.5 time. They offer rooms that are wheelchair accessible. They offer test booklets with larger font, so size 18-point font. They also can offer assistance marking responses in the test booklet. They can offer students to sit closer to the front to make sure that it's easier for them to lip read any type of spoken instructions. They can also provide a sign language interpreter to be able to sign any of the instructions that are read to the students. Keep in mind that any sign language interpretation is just for instructions, not for the actual exam. And there's also approval that's typically given to students who are English language learners, ELL students, to use a word-to-word dictionary. So it can kind of help them understand what some of the words might mean if English is not a native language. Now, what about if what I just listed to you isn't enough, right? Won't give your son or daughter access, that equal access to perform to his or her true abilities? Well, that's where ACT also offers what's called special testing. So special testing does not happen on the national testing dates. It's typically facilitated at your son or daughter's high school. So what are the different criteria to be able to get special testing? So if you're applying for more than 50% time, so you're applying for double time or you're applying for triple time, or are you applying to take the test over multiple days? Keep in mind, I'm going to come back over here, this national 50% time extension, that's 6 hours, right? That your son or daughter is going to be there on a single day taking the test. That's a very long day. And there are some students who struggle with focus, who struggle with kind of sustained attention, where having to sit for 6 hours in one day and take this entire test would, again, not put them in a position in which they have an equal opportunity to show their abilities. So that's where students will apply to take the test over multiple days. So they maybe get 50% extended time, but they have several weeks to take the exam where they can kind of break it up, and they take English on one day, and then maybe a couple days later they take the math. A couple days later they take the reading, right? So if you get more than time and a half, so double or triple time, or if you take the test over multiple days, that is considered special testing. Also, if you require an alternate test format, so maybe you need the exam in Braille or audio format or with a reader, right? Those are also facilitated with special testing. And then lastly, if you required a scribe or a computer to do the writing test, or if you needed extended time just for the writing section. So this is probably a lot of information right now. What I'm showing you next are kind of those special breakdowns for the types of accommodations that you can apply for. Now, I'd say that 99% of people only know about Code 6. They only know about time and a half in a single session. So again, you would end up taking it with kind of the national testing dates. You go to a random high school on a weekend, you take the test with extra time there. Most families don't know about these other options, which is really important for you to actually know what is available that ACT offers, so that again, you can work with your school, you can work with a learning coordinator, you can work with whoever is your son or daughter's advocate, and make sure that you're applying for the correct code number when you originally submit your documentation. So what you'll notice, right, is that we have options for double time that I just mentioned. That's code 2, triple time, standard time. So you don't get extra time. However, they let you take it over multiple days. So again, no extra time, but just the ability to break it up so that you're not doing it in one 4-hour session. The other option here is to, again, not get extra time, but you can stop the clock to take breaks at any time. So if I'm in the middle of the English section and 20 minutes have gone by and I have 25 minutes left, if I just say, hey, I need a break and I need to go outside and I need to just walk around for 10 minutes or whatever I need to do, they will stop the clock, right? So any of those breaks don't count against me in the time that I have to complete a session. Time and a half in a single session, I mentioned that one to you, right? That one's the one that most people know of. It's also the one that most schools promote to students, because if you think about it, the other options typically require that someone from the school is helping to facilitate the experience. And in general, schools tend to be very overwhelmed, and they're probably not signing up and volunteering their time to help facilitate these types of things. So this is where self-advocacy is huge, and you really have to work with the school and say, you know, this is what my son or daughter should receive. This is what ACT is providing. And then the school is legally obligated to administer the test with this special testing format. I mentioned previously the time and a half. So same thing, 50% time. It's just instead of taking it in one day, you're taking it over multiple days. And then the last code that's available is standard time. So again, no extra time on the test. However, for the writing section, for the essay at the end, you get double time. So assuming that one of those codes fits what would make sense for your teen, next step for you is to get all of the documentation together. So what is ACT looking for? ACT is looking for, again, this kind of formal educational neuropsych testing, right? They want to see that there has been a licensed professional who has conducted some sort of analysis or diagnosis. If you have ADHD or a learning disability, they want one of these formal neuropsych assessments or educational assessments to have occurred in the past 3 years. If you have a visual disability, they want to see that you have worked with a doctor in the past year. Same thing if you have a medical or a psychiatric disability, that 1-year term. So notice that it's different, right? So you have to be aware that depending on what you are applying for and what the disability might be, it's critical that you have the documentation in that time range, because they tend to be pretty inflexible with that. What else do they want to see? Well, they want to see that there's some sort of record that whatever it is that you're requesting from ACT is something that your son or daughter is receiving at school, right? So if you're at a public school, what is the IEP plan? What is the 504 plan? We want to see that there's something documented on record at school that the student is using this accommodation. Same thing if you're at a private school, they're typically called service plans or learning plans. They want to be able to see that the school has received this documentation and that the school is providing this accommodation that you are asking ACT to also provide. All right, so step 3 is apply for the accommodation. So once you've determined we're eligible, we've got all this documentation ready to go, what do you do next? This is a key place that ACT and SAT are different. With the ACT, you cannot apply for any accommodations until you are registered to take the test. So if you want to apply now, maybe even if your son or daughter isn't going to take the exam until June or July, like if it still seems like it's farther away, or maybe even into the fall, you still have to register for the test before you can submit the documentation. So that's important for you to know. And SAT doesn't require that. So you can send your documentation to a College Board who makes the SAT. You can send your documentation to them even if you're not registered. But this is something different about the ACT that parents get confused about, because everything just gets sent to College Board. And then they expect that it also goes to ACT, but they don't realize that ACT will not consider you for accommodations unless you are registered to take the test. So make sure that you pick that date and register. When you are applying, you're going to indicate, are you in the national extended time, or kind of like the national bucket of what you're looking for, or are you in that special testing bucket, excuse me. So remember, they're kind of those two different ways that they break up the different accommodations that they provide. Once you know what you're applying for, you have to connect with someone from your school, right? So there is a designated person at every high school who is the test accommodations coordinator. You will connect with that person and work with that person to submit the request to ACT for accommodations. That also includes all of that documentation, right? So any reports from doctors, any reports from neuropsychological assessments, any kind of additional records from teachers. ACT even has a form that current teachers can fill out to provide kind of evaluation of a student and to support the case for a student to receive an accommodation. So you're going to get all of those documents together and submit them. One thing that I can share with you, I had a text message from a student today where her mom was working with the test accommodations coordinator at her school, gave her all the documentation, and then the person from the school made a mistake, submitted everything to ACT without a lot of the extra documentation. So the mom had to get involved, correct things, make sure that everything happened properly and how it was supposed to. So anyway, it's hard because the people working at your schools are very well intentioned, but sometimes they're overwhelmed, they overlook details. So I promise you that kind of from the parent perspective, you have to keep a pretty close pulse on these things to make sure that if the school, test accommodations coordinator requests anything from you, that you can provide it, that you can kind of be a part of pulling all of this together and then making sure that it's submitted correctly. Then you wait. To hear back. So after everything is submitted to ACT, the test accommodations coordinator, the TAC, is going to be the one who submits the request and who then hears back. Now, what I've done on this slide is just kind of snipped. This is from ACT's website. It shows you the exact same information that I just gave you. Notice step 1 is to register to test. Again, ACT is not going to review your accommodations requests unless you are registered. So then what do you do, right? So you're waiting. It typically takes about 2 to 7 weeks to hear back from ACT with a decision. I would say that with COVID and what we've seen in the past year is that it's been closer to the 7-week mark versus the 2-week mark. So important for you to know that you really need to plan ahead. What's going to happen? This is a huge point of confusion for families. So I cannot impress enough how important it is that you know that when ACT makes its decision, they are not going to email the parent. They are not going to email the student. They email the school. They email that testing accommodations coordinator. I have seen horror stories where the testing accommodations coordinator at school receives an email with a decision from ACT and then doesn't notify a family for 2 months. So they've lost all of this time. They didn't realize that they had the opportunity to appeal, and it's very, very stressful. So from when you apply, I recommend you kind of put reminders in your calendars, maybe 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. Ping the person from your school to make sure that the person is checking actively to see if a decision has been made. Because again, this person at your school is coordinating this for a lot of students and things can get missed on accident. So make sure that you know that you are not going to hear from ACT when they make a decision. That notification of an approval or a denial is going to the school coordinator. So you're going to have to really stay on top of that to make sure that you are also aware if a decision has been made. Okay, so if you're approved for national extended time or for an accommodation that is given with national testing, then basically your admission ticket that you print from your ACT student login is going to reflect in the upper corner kind of what accommodations you receive. You show up at whatever that random site is on a Saturday or Sunday to take the test, and because it's on your admission ticket, what accommodation you're supposed to receive, that testing site will honor that. Technically, the person from your school is also supposed to notify the testing center in advance so that they know that you're coming and what it is that they need to provide to you. What about special testing? So remember, the special testing categories, these were more of kind of the opportunities for double time or triple time or taking the test over multiple days. You don't do that at a random high school on a Saturday or Sunday, right? That is something that is coordinated directly with your school. So that person from your school, that accommodations coordinator, is going to be the one to work directly with you and your son or daughter to arrange all of the testing accommodations. You'll pick the days, you'll pick the times when each section of the exam is taken. Now, what happens if you're denied? This is really important to go over. If you are denied, the letter from ACT will clearly enumerate why you weren't approved. So they'll make it very clear, we require additional documentation to address X, Y, and Z. So the burden on you is when you receive this letter that if you weren't approved, why not? What does ACT want? What other information do they need to be able to re-review the application? Then it's up to you, again, do you need additional testing? Do you need additional evidence? Do you need additional reports from teachers? Do you need some sort of private evaluator to put together a letter or report to support the case for the accommodation? Keep in mind, this is where these things can drag on. It can take another 6 weeks just to process the appeal and to hear back on the appeal. So even though, their technical deadlines can be, just a month before a test, they want to have the requests in, you really want to plan for these things months and months in advance, because you don't know what ACT is going to say. You don't know how long it's going to take before you even hear about the decision. If the person from your school is going to be on top of notifying you, then you would need time to kind of regroup and get additional documentation or testing. Then you reapply and wait again. So please, I cannot impress enough how important it is to plan this in advance so that, again, it's just less stressful, because the last thing you want is, oh, I want to take the ACT in April. Well, that test is in 2 months. And what if we don't even hear back on the accommodation until the week before, right? That's just making this whole situation even harder for a student. So the more you can be on top of preparing these things in advance, again, it just kind of keeps a lot of that anxiety at bay. Fifth step, kind of the easy one, using the accommodation, right? So come test day, if you're going to take it with with some sort of national accommodation or national extended time, as I mentioned, your registration ticket will indicate what you receive. You show up at the testing site and the accommodations will be provided. Whereas if you're getting any of those special testing categories, you will have coordinated all of the specifics with your school in advance, and that coordinator at your school is responsible for overseeing your testing administration. Now, just to give you a sense of the deadlines, again, I just mentioned these are the deadlines for if you are taking the test in April, you have to submit your documentation by March 26th to even be considered for accommodations. But I do not recommend waiting for these deadlines, right? I really recommend that you submit as early as possible, even 6 months in advance, maybe even a year in advance. I mean, whatever you need to do so that you can have this figured out and build in that buffer of time just in case you need to appeal and you need to go through that process. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the SAT. You'll notice there are going to be a lot of similarities, but also some kind of unique differences in terms of how College Board, which is the organization that administers the SAT, how do they review accommodations? What is their process? Same 5 steps, they'll just be, again, kind of little differences as we go through. So what are the requirements to determine eligibility for College Board? So College Board number 1, same as ACT, wants a certified evaluator to have a documentation of some sort of limitation or disability. Just like the ACT, they want it very clearly stated, how is this disability going to have a direct impact on test performance for a test that's administered by College Board? That could be the SAT, that could be the PSAT, that could be the AP exams, right? What's nice about College Board is once you receive an accommodation, it applies to any of those tests. So if you receive 50% extended time for your SAT, you're also going to get it for your APs. So again, it's nice that kind of with that one agency, it can apply to all those tests and you don't have to apply for each one. This again goes back to what I mentioned earlier with the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? It's all about the ADA. It's all about showing them that there is this limitation or there is this inability to perform to your potential if you don't get the accommodation. That is what they want to see. And you can spell it out incredibly clearly, like the ADA guarantees that, insert name should receive the accommodation because, right? You want to make it very, very clear how your application is in line with the protections that are guaranteed by the ADA, right? Because that is a law. And so we are entitled to that protection. And that's what you want to make sure that you convey. Just like ACT, College Board likes to see a history of the accommodations at school. In fact, if you get an accommodation at your school, you're pretty much locked and guaranteed that SAT is going to do the exact same thing that your school does. ACT tends to be a little bit more picky when it comes to that, but College Board tends to be pretty consistent. If you get time and a half at school, you're going to get time and a half on your SAT. As I just mentioned, right, what's nice is that the College Board distributes and scores the SAT, the PSAT, and the AP exams. What are the most common accommodations that people request from College Board? Extended time, definitely the most common, just like with ACT. Large print, we mentioned that earlier with ACT as well. This is really important. If you are a student with any type of visual impairment, these tests have the tiniest, like size 10 font print. It's so hard to read. So it's really important that if you have a visual impairment, you should get the booklet where the text is bigger, because it just, again, is something that you should have to give you equal access to perform to your abilities. Same thing as ACT, they do give an option for the essay to take on a computer. One quick note, in case you missed the webinar we did over the weekend, College Board is getting rid of its essay. So after June of this year, there will no longer be an essay. So if you're kind of looking to take the test between now and then and want to take the essay because maybe you're applying to journalism programs and you want to try to showcase a really strong score, if you would require a computer for the essay instead of handwriting it, keep in mind that that is something that's available. And then just like ACT, they also offer the ability to take the exam in a smaller group setting. That tends to happen naturally because the room with students who have accommodations is a much smaller room. But if there's even something bigger, like you can't be in a room with more than 2 students or more than 3 students, again, those types of things need to be very specific. All right, so you've determined that you're eligible. Let's get together all of that documentation. Now you'll notice this is very similar to what you have to organize for ACT, but the years are different. So with College Board, they're a little bit more flexible. They will accept any type of formal testing in the past 5 years for ADHD or any other learning disability. 2 years with visual, right? Remember with ACT, they were 3 and then 1. So with College Board, they do kind of allow, quote unquote, older assessments to still be submitted and to still be considered valid. But similar to the ACT, College Board also has that 1-year mark for any type of medical or psychiatric disabilities. Same thing as ACT, they love to see, hey, is this being used at school, right? Because if it's being used at school, it just, again, gives more credibility to the case of why you're applying. As I mentioned at the beginning, there are a lot of people who try to take advantage of this. We all saw that with the whole varsity blues, right? That there were all these people who faked learning disabilities so they could get extended time when they didn't need it. Again, the part of that that infuriated me the most is that it took away from students who really did deserve those accommodations, right? And these systems are in place for a reason, and it's to protect students and it's to give them the opportunity to perform at their ability and to give them equal access to do that. So it's critical that these programs are in place. One thing too that's important to mention is that any agreement that you have with ACT or College Board to receive any type of accommodation is completely private. So when you receive your ACT score, if you submit it to colleges, it's not like there's a little asterisk that says, Jennifer got a 34, oh, just note that she got extra time. None of that is ever reported. It's not on your formal test report. It's not given to colleges. This is a completely private experience for the student. So please know that, yes, having this documentation is critical. They won't even review, right, if you don't have the documentation within the timeframes that they've outlined. And please do also know that the longer the history you have with your school, the better your chances of receiving the accommodation. But I've also seen tons of students who maybe were first diagnosed with something in 8th grade, decided, I'm going to go to high school. I'm going to try my best. There's a stigma. I don't want to get extra time. And I understand a lot of students feel that way, right? So they kind of go into high school and they resist that. And then all of a sudden junior year comes around and they're just like, oh my gosh, I have to get these accommodations that I'm supposed to have. They should have been doing it for the past several years. Their teachers noticed that they were struggling. A lot of times teachers too, especially at private schools, are much better at kind of providing accommodations when they know that a student might need an extra 15 minutes or an extra 20 minutes on an exam. So what happens is kind of there's this informal way that the student is receiving accommodations. But then in junior year, it just kind of hits and it becomes a much more structured and formal program. Those students can still receive accommodations, right? They just have to really explain the entire story to ACT or to College Board so that they understand the context and they understand that something was present earlier on. It's just that, there were decisions made in the family whether or not to take advantage of it. And then they got to the point that they just kind of recognized that they really, really needed to do that. Okay, so the process of applying to College Board is different from ACT's process. Remember, I mentioned with ACT, you have to first register, then you can submit documentation. College Board does not require that. So you can submit your documentation to College Board even if you haven't registered for a test. So same thing, once you've determined you're eligible, once you have your documentation together, you're going to complete this form. It's called the Student Eligibility Form, the SEF. There's a little snip of it over on the side. It's going to ask for your information, ask for you to describe the disability, ask you to enumerate these are the accommodations that we desire, and then of course to provide that documentation. Now, after you've completed that form, you actually have two options to submit to College Board. So number one, you can submit the form through your school, right? Through the person with whom you work to oversee any accommodation plan. That tends to be a lot faster. So students who hear back sooner tend to be the ones who kind of work through the school to submit the documentation. But you also don't have to work with your school. You don't need their assistance. You don't need their involvement. You can just submit the form independently. Just keep in mind that it takes a little bit longer for them to review and for them to give you a decision. What about if you need to respond to any additional requests? So again, if you're approved, you don't have to respond to additional requests, right? If you're approved, you're going to get something in the mail. It's going to have this SSD code. You have to enter that code when you register for a test. So the idea is I've applied, I've been approved, I have this special code. Now when I register, I'm going to put in that code, and then that way it's in the system that, hey, these are the accommodations that I receive. If you're denied, same thing as ACT, they're going to clearly articulate to you why you were denied. Just like with ACT, it usually has to do with some sort of inadequate documentation. They want to see more, they want to read more, they want to have more assessments from professionals, more evidence, more testing, etc. So they will tell you why you were denied, give you the opportunity to appeal and to submit those additional documents. Then just like with ACT, we restart the waiting clock, waiting to hear back on the appeal. Last step is to use the accommodation come test day, right? So you will, when you register, as I mentioned, you enter that special code. That is going to ensure that you get the accommodations on the testing day. And then you always, 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 just in case, want to have that eligibility letter. This is true for the ACT as well. It was remiss of me. I should have put this on the earlier slide. When you get a letter from ACT or you get a letter from College Board that says you have been approved, right? Remember with ACT, that letter is going to the school, not to you. So you have to make sure that the school forwards you the PDF, that you save it, print it, and when you show up to take your test, you should have your admission ticket and you should have that eligibility letter, because just in case something isn't organized, something falls through the cracks, you want to make sure that you can prove day of, no, I am supposed to have this. Here is my letter. Okay, here are the dates for SAT. You'll notice there are a couple extra dates in here because I did put the PSAT 10 exams and then also the APs. One thing to note is that the AP exams are actually going to be happening for 6 weeks this year. Kind of the first 2 weeks of May is kind of administration 1. Then they're going to have a second administration in the second 2 weeks of May, and then a third administration in the first 2 weeks of June. So keep in mind, if you are in a position that you should be receiving accommodations, these exams are coming up. So if you have a sophomore or a junior who's in AP classes and needs to receive these accommodations, you should absolutely get on it and get this stuff submitted. If you're in a position, maybe you have a sophomore who's not going to be taking the SAT until next year, of course, you have a little bit more breathing room. But as I mentioned before, I would just get this stuff in, get it just approved so that that's off your plate and you don't have to worry about it. I've seen so many parents who are so stressed out about this process, especially with schools being closed. It's even harder to communicate with people at your school. And there are just all of these extra factors that have really compounded to make this process way more difficult than it should ever be. So please make sure that you note that to get ahead of this is really, really critical. Okay, so next thing I'd like to do is go to your questions. So I'm going to go ahead and open up, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or in the Q&A. Oh, this is a great question. What happens if your test gets canceled? Will your approval on a test carry over? Well, fingers crossed, we're not going to have a lot of test cancellations anymore. Clearly, we've had a lot of those over the past year. But what if you're registered, let's say for April, and I get extended time? Maybe my test isn't canceled, but maybe I choose to move it to June, or I choose to move it to July. Again, amazing question. Once you are approved for accommodations, they will stay with you no matter when you take the test. So if I was registered for April and then I decided, you know what, I don't really feel ready, I'm going to wait and I'm going to take this test in June, I don't have to reapply for accommodations. If I've already been approved for April, those are going to carry down. What about registering for an ACT? So pretty much in July is when ACT will allow you to register for all of the tests in the future year. So in July of 2021, you'll be able to register for the tests in September, October, December, February, April, June, and July of the next year. So what you'll want to do is pay attention to that. And a lot of times students who are sophomores right now, once that time frame hits for ACT, even if your son or daughter isn't taking the test until spring of junior year, it's almost a year away, you can still apply. So you just want to get registered and then submit that documentation. Great questions. Let me look in the chat. It looks like something may have come in here. If you sign up for the SAT and the ACT, and then you decide just to take the ACT, do you have to cancel or can you just not show up? So another great question, thank you. And this answer, by the way, applies whether you have accommodations or whether you're just registered to take the test. If you are registered and you don't show up, absolutely nothing happens except that you lose your $60 to $80, depending on whether you signed up for the essay or not. So it's perfectly okay to just not show up. Nothing goes on an official record. It doesn't say, here's Jennifer's score report. In April, she showed up and got this score, and in June, she didn't show up and has nothing. It literally just disappears. It's like the test doesn't happen and there's no record of it. The only reason to maybe possibly try to notify them would be if there's a way you can get your money back. That's always nice. So you can cancel, and if it's far enough ahead, you should be able to get a refund. But in general, if you're registered for both, you decide to, take one over the other The other one you can try to cancel, or yes, you can just not show up. Any other questions? And I'm happy to answer any just general questions about ACT or SAT or anything like that as well. We've worked with so many students who are in this position of needing to secure these accommodations while also needing to develop learning plans for the ACT or SAT that are sensitive to whatever the unique struggles are that they face. So I'm more than happy to answer those questions. Tried to add, okay, good point. So test information release is a program that's offered by ACT. It's $22, and when you register is when you want to sign up for test information release. So if you are registering for the April exam or the June exam, again, this is for ACT, it's $22, and you actually get a copy of your test back. So you can see the actual real PDF of the exam and you can see your answers. So I had students who took the ACT in December. They were retaking in February. They just retook it last weekend on February 6th. And a week before, they actually got from ACT their December exam. So it was this incredible study tool for them because a week before the test, they could see the one that they took previously. They could review all of their mistakes. It was amazing. So if you are going to sign up for test information release, please make sure that you add that when you originally register, because they tend to be a pain about trying to add it after the fact. Sometimes they do let you do that. They have a form on their website that you can fill out and pay and mail it in, but it tends to be a pain, and you can only then request it after the exam. So let me take a step back because I feel like I didn't explain that clearly. Let's say I want to register for the April ACT. Ideally, I should add test information release when I sign up. Let's say I forgot, I didn't know it was offered. Oops, I made a mistake. You have to wait until you actually take the exam. Then you can fill out the form and apply to add test information release. But if I figure out between now when I register and the real test, oops, I meant to add that service, they're not going to let you add it. They're going to make you wait until you actually take the test. Okay, next question. If ACT or SAT is taken multiple times, do accommodations have to be entered each time? So once you have been approved and it is in their system, and by there I mean ACT system or College Board system, those accommodations are there in your account when you log in. So you don't have to worry about entering these things over and over. Once you have your student account and you have these accommodations on record, then you'll just continue to register for exams. Next question, when is a good time to take the SAT if you're in 10th grade? So the number one deciding factor for when you are ready to take the SAT or the ACT is what math class you're in. So when it comes to preparing and learning the grammar rules and becoming a strong reader, I mean, freshmen could totally be ready to take that test, right? As long as they've learned those rules and they're strong readers. But the math is really the main driving factor for when you're ready to take the test. So both the ACT and the SAT go through Algebra 2 with trig. So if you have a 10th grader who is currently taking Algebra 2 with trig, that means that at the end of this year, he or she will have been exposed to all of the math that could possibly come up on the ACT or SAT. Now, that being said, keep in mind that just because you've been exposed to it doesn't mean you're going to remember all of it. So even though maybe at the end of 10th grade, you've learned as hard as the questions can get, it's very likely you're still going to need to put in time to review some of the earlier stuff that you maybe haven't even seen since 7th or 8th grade, just to make sure all of that is fresh. Now, if you are taking Algebra 2 trig as a junior, then it's a little bit harder for you to schedule because you really need to wait until the end of junior year to take the exam, unless you put in a lot of time on your own to supplement and kind of teach yourself that Algebra 2 trig so that you could be ready to take it earlier in your junior year. And we do have a lot of students we support who are in Algebra 2 trig as juniors, but they're a little bit stressed out about waiting until the end to take their first test. So they can just leverage our curriculum to go through and kind of put in some extra time, expose themselves to what they won't learn until the end of their junior year in math class, but they just learn it a little earlier so they're ready for the ACT or SAT. And then also it's kind of a bonus because then at the end of their math class, they've already learned a lot of the content. So it's a bit easier. So that question that was just asked, when is a good time for 10th graders? I can't answer it for everybody, but the way that I can answer it is to say that what you want to do is think about math, and that math is the driving factor that will determine when you're ready, because you really want to make sure that you've been exposed to Algebra 2 and Trig, because it's a third to a half of the questions are just from that 1 year of math. And if you haven't been exposed to it, right, you really have no shot at getting those questions right. Next question. My grandson is just like your example, so he is now just using his accommodations. How does he explain this for his appeal? So I think that what you mean by my example is that maybe it's someone who was originally diagnosed earlier, kind of decided, I'm not going to really do this. I don't want to, talk about this at school. I don't want to, pursue these things, but now is in a situation of going, wow, okay, maybe I really do need this, and maybe I do need to apply for this. So what's most important to explain in the appeal is, again, you have to be able to show a longevity of the issue. You don't want to have it appear that this thing magically came out of nowhere 2 weeks ago. Nothing was an issue, for 16 or 17 years. And now all of a sudden he needs double time, right? That's not going to be believable. So the burden on you in the appeal is, again, scour your records, look for anything from 2nd grade, 3rd grade, even middle school, reports from teachers who might be willing to write a short letter of support on behalf of your grandson, right? So look for opportunities to show the longevity and then also the severity of the issue. So if you can, have the person who did the neuropsych assessment put together a cover letter, or if there's a pediatrician or a doctor who could maybe speak to an anxiety disorder or speak to something that's come up for the student, that, again, always bring it back to this idea. It's about equal access. Your burden is to show that there is a substantial limitation or impairment, and that the only way your son or daughter or grandson will be able to perform to his or her abilities is with this accommodation. That is that is the burden of proof, right? That is what you have to show when you submit the documentation. So anything that you can do, or any documents that you can pull together that will support that story, again, that's what's really, really critical. Okay, let's see. For the SAT, do you have to supply a testing coordinator to help with the testing also? What if your school cannot supply that? If a certain company that can supply a testing coordinator for your child for private schools, hang on, let me read this a little bit more. Okay. Sorry, it was a long question, so I want to make sure I understood everything that was being asked. So I have seen in the past a student who was who was approved for an accommodation, and the school was basically like, well, this is great that ACT gave this to you, but we're not going to facilitate this for you. You have to find someone else to proctor it. So I don't know how many of you joining are in San Diego, but there's a center in Solana Beach. It's called Fusion. It's a place, I think, that actually where students can take classes as well. But what the student had to do is hire Fusion, and Fusion proctored the exam for him. So because his school basically just said, sorry, we know you got this from ACT, but we're not going to facilitate it for you, find someone else, the family did. And they found that Fusion was an approved testing site. ACT sent this student's exam to Fusion, and he coordinated with Fusion directly to be able to take the exam. Now, that isn't what should happen, especially at a private school, where families are obviously investing a lot and are kind of looking that if these types of things come up, that a school will be able to be accommodating and supportive, but it does happen. So, at a public school, because of the law, because of those 504 plans and everything like that, you can really push. But it could happen that at a private school, they say, yeah, okay, this is available, but we're not going to do it. Sorry. And then as a parent, you do have to find another place where the testing can be administered, where ACT or SAT will approve the site, because that's the other thing too. Someone just posted a question about the recording being available. Yes, I am recording, and I will upload it and get it onto YouTube, and then I'll send an email to everyone who attended today with the link to it. Next question, is La Jolla Country Day a test center for the SAT? Now, what's happened in the past year has really obviously turned a lot of things upside down. So there are schools, and I know that La Jolla Country Day is an example of this, where back in the fall, they saw that things were getting really disrupted for their students who were trying to take these exams. So they applied to ACT and to College Board to become testing sites where the school actually administers the exam during a school day. So if you have a son or daughter at La Jolla Country Day, March 2nd is the official day that the juniors will be taking the ACT. March 3rd is the day that they will be taking the SAT. And I've seen this trend across the country, right? We work with schools and families all over the US. And I saw this a lot really starting in the fall with the boarding schools. So the private, these private boarding schools were becoming testing sites because their students were, supposed to take it at a random high school and it was getting canceled. And so the schools took it on themselves to become the testing sites, where again, they're actually canceling school for a day where the students, and by students, I mean juniors, they're kind of restricting these opportunities to juniors so that they can control how many people are there, spacing them apart, keeping things safe, etc. So in general, La Jolla Country Day is not a test center for SAT, right? Because if you go to La Jolla High or if you go to Torrey Pines, you can't take the SAT at La Jolla Country Day. But La Jolla Country Day is going to be a test center just for its students. So again, a lot of schools, and if you go to a school and you don't see this happening, you can absolutely advocate for your son, daughter, grandson, granddaughter, reach out to the school counselors. You can say, hey, there are schools who are becoming testing sites. Grossmont Union School District, we do a lot of support for schools in Southeast San Diego. They became testing sites for their students to be able to have access to take these exams. So again, it is something that's possible, but it takes a lot for the school to coordinate. So again, you want to make sure that you can kind of push gently with your emails and your advocacy on behalf of your kids who are at these schools. But it is an option, and it does then guarantee that they take it, and it of course guarantees that they're taking it in a safe place where there aren't as many students. But yeah, back in the fall, actually, what I saw in San Diego specifically is that the ACT exams were administered. So what ACT actually did is they offered the exam 7 times in 2 months, 7 times in September and October. And all of those tests happened in San Diego. And what they did is instead of offering the exams at schools as the testing sites, they worked with the Sheraton, and they basically ended up offering the exams in ballrooms at Sheraton hotels, from North County down to downtown. Whereas College Board canceled a lot of its SATs in the fall because they weren't administering at schools and the schools were closed. The February exam, I guess I don't need to knock on wood anymore because it's in the past, but it happened, and it happened in San Diego. So we'll have to see what happens, with the upcoming SAT in March. And then the ACT is in April, right? So again, these are for those national test dates. But if you're taking it at your school, or if your school has become a special, testing site or a school testing site, then you don't have to worry as much about those national dates. Okay, any other questions? I have a nice note about thank you, and this was informative. I'm really happy to hear that. You're welcome. I know that this process is incredibly stressful for families. And so if there's anything that I can do, any other questions that I can answer, please always don't hesitate to reach out. We're also happy to do, 15, 20-minute consultations with families to answer very specific personal questions, right? Because clearly if you're embarking on this process, there are a lot of extra moving parts to manage and to manage sensitively. So if there is ever any way that we can support or answer those types of questions, please feel free to reach out. I'll give another second, see if we have any other questions. We're getting lots of thank yous. All right, so I guess that means that hopefully you all feel like your questions have been answered. So again, thank you so much for joining me. Nice to connect with you all and to answer your questions, and good luck with this journey of applying for accommodations. And my last piece of advice is just stay on top of it. because the schools are managing this for a lot of students, but you're, really just have your eye clearly on your son, daughter, grandson, or granddaughter. So really important that you can, keep a pulse on everything that's happening and when it's happening so that things don't slip through the cracks. Good luck, everyone. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care.